Beautiful, beautiful. That was Rabbi Shlomo Katz singing a Shlomo Carlebach melody. So beautiful. The words of that are from the Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur liturgy. And basically he's singing in Hebrew, let everything that has been made know that you are its maker. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? This is some much needed counter programming on a crazy night. Let's spend 40 minutes together lighting up the darkness. Who is going to be with us? And we have a great daf. We have some really beautiful wisdom teachings tonight. Who is going to be with us? Yehuda from Florence, South Carolina. James from Indianapolis. Sharon from Lebanon, New Jersey. Melissa from Great Neck, Stephen from Dover, New Hampshire, who just got back from volunteering at the polls, Nancy from North Carolina, Rochelle from Pacific Grove, Anne from Merced, Tracy from Oklahoma, Pam from Nashville, who loves the music, Carol from Cleveland, Annie from Michigan, who's joyfully in the house, Susan is with us from LA, Kat from Fayetteville, North Carolina, Chaim from Charlotte, Sarah from Los Angeles, Tom from Pennsylvania, Delana says hello, Susan says hi, Sarah, Annie says thank you, Sal, for making this commitment and doing such an amazing job. Thank you, Annie, for the acknowledgement. Denise from Vancouver, Washington, Sarah says shalom, and Lucy is with us from Minnesota. All right. Oh, and Lynn just checked in on the YouTube side from North Texas. So we've got all of America represented here. Let's get into it. What are we going to be learning this evening? We are holding on Daf Pei Vav, that's page 86 of Tractate Eruvin, the third volume of the Talmud. We're in chapter 8. Today we're going to cover a short and juicy Mishnah, Mishnah number 5, and then open our discussion of Mishnah number 6. This fifth Mishnah of chapter 8 is great. If you're with us for the first time, let us know so that we can welcome you. But this is actually a pretty good place to land because it's got some just, good wisdom that's relevant to everybody in all situations. But also, it's kind of like a simple place to throw the, that grapple hook on. So many Talmudic concepts, they're big, they require some background, it takes a little while to catch up. But here, it's a kind of punchy, small concept that I'll explain what it's all about, and you can really get your teeth into it, right? So this Mishnah is talking about what happens in a courtyard when there is an absent resident, and how does that affect the other residents of the courtyard. Now, generally, I'm going to do just a little quick review. If you've been with us all along, it's review, but in case you're new, so if you've got multiple houses sharing a courtyard, which is a common living situation in the Talmudic era, we're talking about 2,000 years ago, more or less. And so there were multiple houses sharing a courtyard. So there's a biblical prohibition. It's part of guarding the sanctity of Shabbos, that we don't do the work of the week on Shabbos, right? We refrain from doing any kind of work on Shabbos. What kind of work do we refrain from doing? Well, there's 39 categories of prohibited labor, and they're generally speaking all of the labors that were necessary to construct the tabernacle when the children of Israel were wandering in the desert. The tabernacle was the place where God sort of manifested, God is everywhere. We're inside God. But God made a manifestation that would demonstrate to the people that God's presence was with them. His attention was right on them. This was the place where they would bring sacrifices, where the altar was, where the menorah was, the candelabra with the lights that sort of would shine out into the world. This is where the Jews received the Torah at Mount Sinai, and in the Torah were the instructions to build the Mishkan, to build the tabernacle, and it was all the labor involved in building the tabernacle that we're prohibited to do on Shabbos. One of those labors is carrying. We don't carry stuff on Shabbos. We can carry it around our house, within our house, okay, but we don't take things from our house out into the public domain, nor do we carry things from the public domain into our homes, nor do we carry things in the public domain more than 4 cubits. That's just one of the labors we refrain from doing on Shabbos. In the time of King Solomon, which is quite a bit later, right? That's going to be 600 years later than when the Torah was given in the wilderness. In the time of King Solomon, the people were established in the land. They'd been there for a long time. And so there was a lot of these kind of setups, courtyards with several homes in them. Now, even though it was a private courtyard owned by the owners of, let's say there's 4 houses in a courtyard, because they all have rights to walk around and store things and walk through and carry things through this shared courtyard. So even though it's a private courtyard, because it's shared, it has the characteristic of being a public domain. So the sages said, even though it's private in the sense that it's shared just by these 4 homeowners, it's public enough that you're not going to be allowed to carry objects from your house even into your own courtyard, since other people than you have a right to use that courtyard as well. What do? The sages, when they said you can't do that, they also gave the cure. They said, but you can carry if you form an eruv. So an eruv is a joining of the courtyard. In other words, a joining of the rights in that courtyard. So it's as if, because when there's one house in a courtyard, you don't need an eruv. Of course, you can carry in and out of your house to your own yard because other people don't have ownership rights in that yard. So for the purposes of Shabbos, we make as if those 4 houses are all one house. And how do they all join their rights as if there's just one house there? Each of the houses contributes a little bit of food into a common vessel, let's say a basket, and then they deposit that basket in one of the houses. And if everybody joins in the eruv, then everyone can carry objects in and out of their own houses and to the courtyard and back. But if any of the houses don't participate in the eruv, that restricts the other people, because now there's somebody who didn't join in the eruv and who does have rights to carry in the courtyard, and that's going to prohibit the other people from carrying in the courtyard, according to that decree that came out in the time of King Solomon. So it really encourages neighborly relations, right? You have to deal with your neighbors, you have to come to terms, and you have to, it's not a big deal. You don't have to, hang out in each other's houses. You don't even have to have meals together, but you each have to contribute a little bit of food into this common vessel, and it has to be stored in one of the houses in the courtyard. Now, the question that comes up in our Mishna that we're studying today is, what if, let's say there's 4 houses in the courtyard, and they haven't established the eruv. Now, when you establish an eruv, it can last. You don't have to do this every week, but from time to time, you have to renew it. You can put food that's going to keep, right? Because you're not going to eat the food in the vessel. It's just kind of symbolically joining all of the houses into one. But from time to time, you have to renew the eruv. So let's say it's time to renew the eruv. The food has expired, somebody ate it, the dog ate it, it's gone. They need to renew the eruv. But it turns out that one of the residents is gone. He went away for the weekend, and when they want to renew the eruv, which they have to do before Shabbos begins, before Friday night, before nightfall on Friday. But let's say that they go to do it on Friday morning, and one of the residents, it turns out, he and his family left for the weekend. So he's absent. He owns one of the 4 houses, but he is not available to contribute to the eruv. Now, he's not available. He's definitely gone. The question is, does he restrict the others? We know that if one of the houses doesn't join and the resident is there during Shabbos, it's going to restrict the others. If he didn't join the eruv before Shabbos, on Shabbos, he cannot join the eruv. Then it's too late. What he can do, because he can't carry in and out of his house to the courtyard anyway, he can renounce his rights to the others, and then the rest of them can carry, even though that fellow who didn't join the eruv and his family can't. Now, here's the thing. He didn't join the eruv. He didn't renounce his rights in the eruv. He and his family are not here at all. Does he restrict the other ones who did join an eruv? Does he restrict them from carrying, or is their eruv going to be valid? Because it doesn't matter that he didn't join since he's not here anyway. There's an empty residence. Does it count as if it's not a residence at all? If it's going to be empty all of Shabbos, is it as if there's only 3 houses in the courtyard rather than 4? That's the question that's going to be addressed by tonight's Mishna. And we're going to find that there's 4 rabbis who have 4 different opinions in answer to our question. Rabbi Meir says that this person who is away from for Shabbos, he's not going to be here, he's absent from the courtyard, whether he's a Jew or he's not a Jew, he restricts everybody else. They didn't get the rights from him. They didn't participate in the eruv. He's absent, but he still owns the property. That is a residence in the courtyard that didn't contribute to the eruv. They should have addressed this before Shabbos. Now it's too late. Nobody can carry in and out of their house on Shabbos. This is the opinion of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda says, whether the homeowner and his family are Jewish or not Jewish, they do not restrict. They're not here. What difference does it make that they own the house? There's no one here. They're not going to be using the courtyard because they're not here. So they don't restrict the other ones. As long as they joined in an eruv, they can carry objects in and out of their houses to this shared courtyard. Rabbi Yosei says, no, we're going to make a distinction between the Jew and the non-Jew, between the Jewish owner of that house. If it's a Jewish owner, it's going to be a different situation than if it's a non-Jewish owner. Why? Because if the person is away first during Shabbos and he's Jewish, well, then he's not going to be coming back on Shabbos because it's not the nature of a Jew to return to his home that he was planning to be away all of Shabbos. Right? He went somewhere else, so he's spending Shabbos somewhere else. There's so many restrictions on what we can and can't do on Shabbos, including how far we can travel and what we can carry and in and out of the public domain, etc., that if a Jew arranged to spend Shabbos somewhere else, he's not going to suddenly show up in the middle of Shabbos and then he would restrict us. We can assume he's not coming back. So, if it's a Jew who owns that house and he's away for Shabbos, he doesn't restrict the other members of the courtyard. If it's a non-Jew who owns the courtyard, well, he's not bound by the restrictions of Shabbos. He might have gone away on Friday evening, planning to come back late Friday night or early Saturday morning or Saturday afternoon. He's not doing anything wrong if he does that. He is not obligated in the laws of Shabbos because he's not Jewish. Right? This is a mitzvah, commandment, a set of commandments that applies to Jews, does not apply to non-Jews. So since there's a chance that the non-Jew might return home, according to Rabbi Yosei, he does restrict the members of the courtyard. They should have made arrangements while he was around during the week. As we've seen, a non-Jew cannot join in the eruv there's no point in it because he's not restricted from carrying on Shabbos. He can do whatever he wants. There's no law saying he can't carry in and out of his house. That's a commandment only for Jews. But what the Jews do have to do is make an arrangement with him and explain, okay, there's these laws that bind us, and if a non-Jew shares our courtyard with us, then we have to lease those rights. And it really all it is, it's a symbolic arrangement. And they go to him, they explain what's going on, and they say, will you accept? You have to accept something, but literally it could be a penny. And it doesn't restrict the non-Jew in any way. His life is completely unaltered. His rights in his courtyard are completely unaltered. It's just that the Jews have arranged to symbolically lease the right to carry from the non-Jew who shares their courtyard. Rabbi Shimon says the same as Rabbi Yosei. Okay, so the non-Jew would restrict them because he might come home, etc. With the Jew, you might think that if he stayed in town, right? If he went out of town, he's definitely not coming back on Shabbos. But you might think that if he just simply chose to stay at his daughter's house, right? So let's say it's an older couple, they have grown children, they have a daughter who's married and has her own kids, and so the grandparents are going to go hang out with the grandkids by their daughter's house, which is in town, right? It's within the Shabbos boundary. There's no restriction that they can't walk that far on Shabbos. So they went out, they're staying by the daughter's house somewhere else in the town. So you might think, well, then they might come home on Shabbos. So then they should restrict in the same way that the Gentile would restrict because they might show up, right? And they didn't participate in the eruv. So Rabbi Shimon tells us, no, we don't have to be concerned with that. Even if he's still in the same town, but he's staying at his daughter's house by Shabbos, when he goes there to spend Shabbos at the daughter's house, the idea of coming home to his own house has gone out of his mind. That's Rabbi Shimon's view on this question. And so the Gemara, the commentary on this Mishnah, is going to be quite brief. It's just going to have two ideas. The Gemara, the first Gemara says, and Rav said, the law accords with Rabbi Shimon, right? So the law accords with Rabbi Shimon. If it's a Gentile who shares the courtyard and he's gone away for Shabbos, he might show up, and so he restricts us. We can't carry in and out of our courtyards. If it's a Jew who's gone away, if he went out of town, for sure we don't have to worry about it. He's not coming back. Even if he's in town, but he's staying by his daughter's house, he's not coming back. He doesn't restrict us. We can carry in and out of our houses as long as we have an eruv together. However, says the Gemara, if he's not staying in the home of his daughter and his son-in-law to see his grandkids over there, but rather he's planning to spend Shabbos in the home of his son and his daughter-in-law to see the other set of grandkids and hang out with them over Shabbos, then we cannot, and it's in the same town, then we cannot assume that he's not coming back. He might come back. Why? Because he might get in trouble with his daughter-in-law. The Gemara notes a saying, as people say, it literally says, as people say. So this was a saying even in Talmudic times. As people say, if a dog barks at you, enter. But if a female dog barks at you, leave. Now, this is referring to either the son-in-law or the daughter-in-law, meaning that if you go stay at the home of your daughter, okay, so your son-in-law, might have a problem with you, but he's not going to tell his wife's parents or his wife's dad, you got to leave, right? Because the wife runs the home. But if you go visit your son and his wife, your daughter-in-law, and you get on her bad side, she might make it very difficult for you to stay there, and then you might want to leave. So it's definitely an important piece of wisdom that we should all absorb. Do not get on the bad side of your daughter-in-law. And that's what we learn from this commentary. And there is the difference between the character of a son-in-law and the character of a daughter-in-law, or really between the authority of a son-in-law in his home versus the authority of a daughter-in-law in her home. Let's remember that lesson. If you have comments or questions, please put them in the comments. Now I'm going to start the discussion of Mishnah number 6. And then when we get through that, I'll come back around to the comments and questions. Okay. Let me just check something. Are there any comments on this Mishnah before we go to the 6th Mishnah? Tom Beck says, why does he restrict them when he is not obligated, leasing from the non-Jew? And if the Jew did come home, couldn't he renounce his rights? Very good. If the Jew came home, he certainly could renounce his rights, and he would have to renounce his rights in order for them to carry again. But until he renounces his rights, he would restrict them. It's not a permanent restriction. It's just that until he renounces the rights, he would restrict them. In terms of why is it that a non-Jew who can't participate in the eruv anyway, why does he restrict the others? And that was just it was a decree of the sages. Now the reason makes sense because if somebody else has rights to walk around in that shared courtyard, well, then it's not a private courtyard. It's a shared courtyard, and it has that characteristic of a public domain a little bit. So whether he's Jewish or not Jewish, that's still true. He can't participate in the eruv since he's not obligated. He himself is not prohibited to carry on Shabbos. He's not obligated in the mitzvahs of the Torah. So that's why he owns rights and he restricts. He can't enter the eruv, so you have to come to an arrangement with him through some other mechanism. And that's what the sages said. You have to lease the rights from him. And there's a little bit beneath the surface there that in those times, particularly, there was always danger. There was always danger. Anti-Semitism is as long as there have been Jews, there's been anti-Semitism. And it's fantastic that we have good relationships with our neighbors. But certainly we know, tragically in history, there's been times and places where it was dangerous to live among others not of our kind. And the sages were saying, if you're going to live with people who are not of your tribe, make sure that you have at least a good enough working relationship that you can discuss this law and get those rights. If it's so awkward that you can't get that, you shouldn't be living there. And it was a kind of protective decree that they made in that sense. Maggie Lynn Scott, why does the woman rule the house, especially with visitors? I think they were just saying that is not a law. That is just a practical observation, right? For whatever reason, if you cross the hawse, as it were, that's a British naval term. But if you get on the wrong side of the lady of the house, you're gonna have problems. Guys are gonna be more flexible, but if the lady of the house doesn't want you there, your hours are numbered in that location. And Lucy says, the non-Jew does not participate in the eruv. Does he have to renounce over and over with each eruv? What a good question. I don't know. Is it enough that he renounced once, they made that arrangement with him, so they have rented his rights? It seems to me that you probably only have to do that once, because what you're getting is his rights to carry in the courtyard. It doesn't have to be specific to the eruv that is made, 1 month or when it gets renewed in another month, etc. Probably you only have to get it once, but I'm not sure. Excellent question. All right, let's move on to the 6th Mishnah. The 6th Mishnah gets a little bit technical again, but it's got a very interesting sort of flow through history. So here we're talking about 2 courtyards, neighboring courtyards. As we've discussed before, each courtyard has to have its own eruv so that the residents of the houses in the courtyard can carry objects in and out of their houses to their own courtyards. And if there's a passageway between the courtyards, then they have the option to make a joint eruv so they can carry objects not only within their courtyards, but from one courtyard to another. If there's not a significant enough wall between them, then they are obligated to make one common eruv because they're not really two distinct courtyards. They're really only one courtyard. And if they don't have a passageway between them, a direct passageway from one courtyard to the other, then they're not permitted to make a joint eruv because they really are separate and there's no basis to make a joint eruv. Now we're talking about what happens if there's a wall. There is a wall separating one courtyard from another. And beneath that wall, there is a cistern, right? So a well where they store rainwater, and the residents would draw water from that well. Remember, we're talking about, ancient Israel, Talmudic times. They didn't have, indoor plumbing and pipes, etc. When you wanted water, you went out to the well to get the water. And it would make a lot of sense, so you don't have to build a separate well for every courtyard, that they could have a shared well, right? And it's going to be right on the border between the two courtyards. So that might look something like this, right? There's two courtyards, and beneath the wall, there is a well, there's water in it, and it's right underneath the wall. Now, these two courtyards don't have a joint eruv. They have not made an arrangement where they can carry things from one courtyard to the other. They have separate eruvin. They can only carry things around their courtyards, from their houses to their own courtyards, but not between the courtyards. The problem is, since there's water in that well and it's a shared area, it's beneath both courtyards, so if you pull water out of the well from your side of the well, the part of the well that's under your courtyard, there's going to be intermingling of water in the well, and so it'll just naturally happen that you're going to pull some water out of that well, and it's like water will be coming from where? From underneath the other courtyard. And now it's like you've transferred something, this water, from one courtyard to another, which is prohibited. So that's not allowed. So what are they going to do? How are they going to make a separation that somehow either physically or symbolically is going to separate the two halves of the well so that the residents of both courtyards are free to take water from their side of the well on Shabbos? This is the question that's being asked. Let's read this Mishnah. In the case of a cistern that is located between two courtyards, situated partly in each courtyard, one may not draw water from it on Shabbos, lest the residents of one courtyard draw water from the domain of the other courtyard, unless a partition that is 10 handbreadths high, so 10 tefachim, 10 handbreadths, so about waist high, which is the minimum measure to have a significant wall, a partition. A mechitza is a partition, a separation. And to be significant, it has to be at least 10 handbreadths high. Unless a partition 10 handbreadths high was erected for it as a separation between the domains. This partition is effective whether it is below or whether it is within. Now, these terms require definition. Whether it is below or within. What does below mean and what does within mean? We're going to get to that in a moment. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel said, and this is the subject of an early dispute between the Tanaim. So the Tanaim are the earlier sages, the rabbis that contributed to the Mishnah, and even earlier rabbis than that. So Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, he's kind of like a later sage, but still of the Mishnaic period. And he says that there's earlier generations who were arguing about the same question. What did they say? So Beis Shammai, the Academy of Shammai, the followers of Shammai, said that the partition which permits drawing water must be placed below. And Beis Hillel said that it should be positioned above. Below and above. We still don't know what below and above mean. Rabbi Yehuda said a partition is no better than the wall between them. If there's a wall dividing the two courtyards that passes over the cistern, well, then it's not necessary to make some kind of extra partition, which is going to separate the cistern itself. So in this, our first figure, you can see there's the wall between the courtyards, and then they've built some kind of a partition below that, even lower than the partition between the courtyards. And what we're going to be talking about now is, well, what is the characteristic of that partition below the wall that's between the courtyards, and is it necessary or is it not necessary? We're going to have a machloket. We're going to have a dispute, right? There's going to be different sages arguing for different points of view. Okay, so what exactly are they disagreeing about, and what is necessary? So Beis Shammai generally are going to be more stringent, not always, but usually are going to have a more stringent view, and Beis Hillel are going to have a little bit of a more lenient view, not always, but just generally speaking. So what are they saying? This partition that is going to be made in the cistern, in addition to the wall that passes over the cistern, over the well, what is the characteristic of this partition? What kind of partition is it? Not what is it made of, but what is its location? Is it like just divide the whole cistern in two? Are we going to literally make some kind of a wall that runs the whole depth of the well from top to bottom? Is it going to be in the water? Is it going to be above the water? Is it going to be somewhat in the water, somewhat above the water? Or is it just going to be purely symbolic and it needs to be higher up above the water and where we can see it, so that we're reminded that this partition has been made? Very often, these kinds of things are not really separating the water from one side from the other, but rather it's a symbolic division so that we understand that we went through a kind of spiritual and official separation, even though the waters might intermingle. What kind of separation is it? So Rav Huna is going to comment first, and he's going to say, okay, the dispute between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai looks like this. Beis Hillel, according to Rav Huna, is saying that the partition just needs to be near the top of the cistern. It doesn't even have to go near the surface of the water. We just want to see, when we're looking down into the well from above, that there's a partition there. And it doesn't need to go down all the way where the water is. And Beis Shammai are saying, no, it has to be near the water, not up high at the opening of the well, but it has to be down near the water. It doesn't need to be in the water, but it has to be near the water. That's a dispute between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, according to Rav Huna. But Rav Yehuda says no. And here, by the way, we're just going to distinguish. One of the sages in the Mishna is Rabbi Yehuda, and one of the Amoraim, which are later rabbis, the rabbis of the Gemara, the rabbis of the Talmud, who come a little later, a few hundred years later, there's a Rav Yehuda. So Rav Yehuda is a later rabbi than Rabbi Yehuda. Okay, Rav Yehuda will find his commentary usually in the Gemara, in the Talmud, in the commentary on the Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda appears in the Mishnah, and other statements of his will also be cited in the Gemara. Okay. So Rav Yehuda says, no, the dispute between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai actually is like this. Beis Hillel says it needs to be down in the well, near the water, at least sort of near the surface of the water, maybe touching the surface of the water, according to Beis Hillel. But according to Beis Shammai, the partition needs to be in the water, right? You got to divide one side of the water from the other side of the water. It doesn't matter if some of the water gets across on the surface, but there needs to actually be a partition in the water that maybe goes down to the bottom of the well, right? So it's a partition down there in the bottom of the well. That's according to Rav Yehuda. However, Rabbah bar Rav Hanan takes a kind of compromise position, and has a little bit more logic to it. So he says, and he's talking to Abaye, right? So Rabbah bar Rav Hanan is talking to Abaye and asking a question. But he's basically saying, it seems to me that what Beis Hillel was saying is that it needs to be inside the well, it needs to be near the surface, but it needs to, actually have some of it beneath the surface of the water. So you're dividing the surface of the water and it's visible from above. And Beis Shammai were also saying that it needs to be visible from above. Some of it has to be above the surface of the water. But the main job of this partition is to separate water from water, and so that needs to be in the water. Some of it above, but primarily in the water. So that's how Rabbah bar Rav Hanan understands that earlier dispute between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. But in all these cases, says Rabbah bar Rav Hanan, no matter how you interpret this dispute, the water is going to intermingle. Water is going to get around that partition. Either it's going to go under it or it's going to go over it. I mean, the level in the well sometimes is high, sometimes is low. Water is going to intermingle from the two sides unless you have two separate wells. But we don't have two separate wells. We have one well, and we're making some kind of a partition in the well. But really, we're just not going to come up with such an effective partition that no water is going to get through. So how stringent are we going to be on separating the waters from the waters? And the basic answer is the halacha is the way he saw it. We want to have a partition in there. We want to be able to see the partition from above. We're not concerned that the water is going to mingle from one side to the other. Why? Because in cases of drawing water, the sages are going to be lenient. Because people need water. and if it's too difficult to get the water, and the situations get a little too clumsy, a little too far, a little too stringent in the requirements for getting water on Shabbos, people are going to do it anyway, and they're going to come to violate a rabbinic decree, and it's going to be almost, like inevitable that they do that, and we don't want to create laws that people are going to disrespect and not do their best to heed, and we don't want to put too much of a burden. So when it comes to water and drawing water on Shabbos, whatever particular rules we're talking about, the sages are going to lean toward being lenient so that people can get the water. And so the halacha in this case is it is prohibited to draw water from a cistern located between two courtyards unless a partition that's 10 handbreadths high is constructed over it, right? If you have a wall that's between the courtyards and that wall is 10 handbreadths high, which it would have to be, then you're done, you're covered. However, it does say that the partition has to be 10 handbreadths high over it, and at least a handbreadth of this partition must be submerged beneath the water with another at least handbreadth protruding above the water, right? So if you're not relying on a wall between the courtyards to separate the courtyards, then you're going to need a wall in the well that needs to be 10 handbreadths high, and at least one handbreadth has to stick out above the water. But if you're relying on an upper wall that already separates the courtyards, you're going to have to extend that wall down a little bit, so at least one handbreadth of that wall is in the water. You're not concerned that the waters are going to be mingling. When the people draw water, they will get some water that comes from the other side, but at least you've gone out of your way to make a visible and strongly symbolic partition between the two halves of the well. And in fact, so if you finish there, be like, okay, like we get it. And this is very much like that first figure that we had, right? Where they had a wall over the well, but they extended it down so that part of it would be touching the water and would be within the water. But it turns out that if that is too difficult and too burdensome, there's an alternative solution. And all you actually have to do is put a cross beam over the top of the well. It's a totally different mechanism. But if you put a cross beam over the top of the well, sort of along the property line between the two courtyards, and it has to be at least 4 handbreadths wide, right? So about this wide. So it's a significant beam, that's for sure. And it's over the cistern, then even though it doesn't reach down and touch the water, the people are going to be able to extend their buckets into the water and take water, draw water on Shabbos, because at least they've made that symbolic separation just like the crossbeam that we would put over the entrance of an alleyway when we're doing a merging of alleyways to merge courtyards that open into an alleyway. I'm not going to go into that tonight, but if you've been with us for a while, you know what I'm talking about with that kind of beam adjusting an alleyway for carrying. Okay, so that's how we do it. And and then just very quickly, and then we learned, and that's what Rabbi Yehuda said, that the wall over the well is enough. It doesn't need to extend down. Here it says it does. So they didn't rule with Rabbi Yehuda. But when they're asking, well, where did Rabbi Yehuda get this idea that you wouldn't have to extend the wall down so it touches the water? So they say, well, Rabbi Yehuda holds like Rabbi Yosei. Because Rabbi Yosei, we've learned, he holds that if a wall is 10 handbreadths high at least, so it has that kind of height, but it doesn't reach the ground, it's still a valid wall. Whereas the rabbis who dispute Rabbi Yosei, and usually the law follows Rabbi Yosei, but in this case, it follows the anonymous rabbis who dispute Rabbi Yosei. In other words, it was the majority against Rabbi Yosei on this question. So when you have a situation where there's a wall or a partition, generally speaking, for a wall, to be counted as a wall, to be a significant partition, it has to be at least 10 handbreadths high. But when we say that, we mean it starts at the ground. Rabbi Yosei says it doesn't have to start at the ground. Even if it's hanging in the air, as long as its own height is 10 handbreadths, even if it's 10 handbreadths above the ground, we kind of view it as extending down to the ground. And so he would say it would be a valid partition even if it doesn't reach the ground. The rabbis who dispute Rabbi Yosei say, no. For a wall to be a wall, it has to be 10 handbreadths high, and its bottom has to be less than 3 handbreadths from the ground. Why less than 3 handbreadths from the ground? Because that is the amount of space, that's a rabbinic measurement. Because less than 3 handbreadths from the ground, a goat won't be able to slip under it. But if it's 3 handbreadths or more, a goat could get under it, and then it's considered like it's not closed. Now, this figure is from a sukkah, right? So we build a sukkah during the holiday of Sukkot, and the rabbis will say if the wall is 10 handbreadths high at least, it doesn't have to reach the top of the sukkah. It's still a valid wall. But if you start from the top of the sukkah and you leave a gap at the bottom, the rabbis say if that gap is 3 handbreadths or more, these are not valid walls of a sukkah. It's not a valid sukkah. Rabbi Yosei would permit that even if it was a bigger gap than 3 handbreadths, as long as the wall itself was 10 handbreadths from its bottom to its top. So here, the discussion is, so does Rabbi Yehuda actually hold like Rabbi Yosei? Because Rabbi Yosei says you can suspend walls, and Rabbi Yehuda seems to be saying you can have a suspended wall that doesn't reach all the way down to the water in the well. So it seems like Rabbi Yehuda, his ruling is in accord with Rabbi Yosei. But here, the rabbis of the Talmud are going to show us, this is how we sharpen our thinking. This is why Talmud study makes one smarter. Because when you get at it, it's like, is Rabbi Yehuda saying that a suspended wall, we consider it as extending down, and so therefore his ruling is the same as Rabbi Yosei's ruling? And the rabbis of the Talmud say, no, it's not the same. Because these are different cases, different situations. How are they different? Well, Rabbi Yosei allows that wall in the sukkah, with the gap at the bottom, and Rabbi Yehuda allows that gap over the well. But we don't know if Rabbi Yehuda agrees with Rabbi Yosei's ruling in the case of a sukkah, because Rabbi Yosei might say, well, here we're talking about the laws of eruv and carrying on Shabbos and drawing water on Shabbos, and these laws of eruv are all by rabbinic decree, and we have a general tendency to be lenient with them, and particularly in cases of water. But the commandment to build a sukkah is a biblical, a Torah obligation, not a rabbinic obligation, but a biblical obligation. In other words, God said, build a sukkah. The rabbis defined what a sukkah is, But just because Rabbi Yehuda is lenient in the case of a suspended wall between two courtyards over a well does not mean that he would be lenient in the case of a suspended wall over the ground in the wall of a sukkah, in the case of a sukkah. Likewise, Rabbi Yosei has been lenient with the suspended wall in the case of a sukkah, but he might feel that he can be lenient because the commandment in the Torah is build a sukkah, right? And the fact that the wall can or can't reach the bottom, it's not spelled out in the Torah. And saying that, you can or can't build a wall at that height from the ground, the rabbis are inferring that prohibition that you can't, suspend a wall. The rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Yosei, they're inferring that prohibition from the positive commandment to build a sukkah. On the other hand, when we're talking about the laws of Shabbos, where there's not only positive commandments to remember Shabbos, meaning to honor Shabbos, to sanctify the day, to make a blessing over wine, and do all the positive things we do to enjoy Shabbos, but there are also biblical negative commandments, meaning don't do this, right? Refrain from doing work on Shabbos. You shall not do any labor on Shabbos. Since that is a biblical commandment and the laws of Shabbos are very strong in particular, Rabbi Yosei might not be lenient in the case of a suspended wall over a well. The fact is, because they issued these leniencies in different bodies of law, we can't assume that they would have the same ruling in those other bodies of law. And so we have learned the lesson here is when you hear somebody say, well, I believe or I hold, and then they tell you what their belief is, and it seems like their belief would extend to another situation, well, you can't assume that it would extend to that situation. Hopefully you have a chance to ask that person. But right now we're in the midst of political craziness in America, and there's just a lot of people becoming uncivil and ascribing bad intentions and ascribing evil belief and saying people who disagree with me, it's because they're evil, it's because their beliefs are rotten to the core, and as they behaved in this, even though that's not quite so evil, but if we extend that kind of thinking to this other situation, then we can be sure that those people are rotten and I hate them and I don't want anything to do with them. But we don't know that. We don't know that. Like when we see the way they behave in one issue, we can't assume how they believe about other issues. We have a two-party system in America, and it tends to divide, but not everybody who's a member of one party holds according to everything that their party says. And that's why, and how would we know that? Without getting into a civil conversation with people. So our lesson here, our takeaway from this, distinction between what Rabbi Yosei believes and what Rabbi Yehuda believes is that just because they believe one thing, don't make assumptions about what they believe in other areas. Go and ask the person and have a conversation and see how different you really are. You might discover that you have a lot of common ground between you. All right, let me check if there's any other comments. Okay, new questions on top. Lynn says, Eruvin Shetuf, in other words, joining courtyards or merging alleyways, etc. It seems like the spiritual lesson is that we are rewarded for making agreements and partnerships between us. And on the other hand, if we engage in aloofness or just disagreement for the sake of disagreement, it not only creates a bad feeling, says Lynn, it hinders everybody from having a better quality of life. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, Lynn, but excellent point, right? Like there really is a reward, an immediate reward, not a reward in heaven. Like it's a better feeling and a more productive living experience if we work together with our neighbors. Sharon says, are these partitions suspended somehow, or are they built structurally into the well? The images help define the distinction, but not the practical methodology. Right. So since it's a well, I think that the idea is it's round. So the partition goes across the well, and there's going to be, a support for that partition on the sides of the well. And I think really the question is, how high is the bottom of the partition, right? Is it above the surface of the water? Is it near the surface of the water? Is it under the surface of the water? Or is it at the bottom of the well? And how tall is the partition? Is the top of the partition going to be submerged beneath the surface of the water, or just over the surface of the water, or well above the surface, or at the top of the well itself? And these are the issues that they're arguing about. But you make a great point. There's so many of these laws that, okay, we learn them in theory, but then if we have to actually go build the eruv, how are we going to do that? And then, we really what we'd want is a contractor who's experienced working with a rabbi and getting these things right. And finally, Lucy says, isn't the cistern its own domain if it is deep enough? Good. I had the same thought as I was reading it, and I was unsure. She says, isn't the cistern its own domain if it's deep enough? So you don't need to separate the water itself between the courtyards. Right. But even though it's its own domain, right, because if the bottom of the well is 4x4 handbreadths, then that's what makes it its own domain, and it has to be at least 10 handbreadths deep. But now it's a different problem, right? You're drawing out of its own domain and into your private domain. That's also disallowed on Shabbos. So maybe what's going on is that the bottom of the well is not 4x4 handbreadths, or the whole thing is not quite deep enough. In this discussion, they're not addressing your question. So I'm not sure what the answer is and why it's permitted. I mean, it might be that you could just draw the water and drink it while you're right there over this other domain. In that case, then now your question is, okay, well, if you're drawing from its own domain, why is it regarded as from the other side? So the answer must be that for whatever reason, it's not its own domain. It's subservient to the two courtyards. And I'm not sure if it's because it lacks depth or because, what's happening is you're pulling out and then into your side. I'm not sure exactly what the reasoning is. It's a great question. Okay, my friends, that's what I've got for us tonight. Yasher koach to you, right? You spent some time, you carved out some time, even on this tense and crazy night in the United States, to do some learning of eternal values. No matter what the results are tonight or whenever the results come in, what you learned tonight, may it stay with you always. And what you learned is eternal values that will be a blessing to you in this world and in the next world. All the best.